Hello, good evening. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And I know some of you, especially I think the president of AFAD here, who I would love to thank very much for his incredible work with Syrian refugees and for humanitarian relief. So thank you for being here. Thank you. Perfect.
So Rula, let me do a quick introduction and then we're going to start our conversation. Merhaba, selamlar herkese. Türkçe mi yapsak, İngilizce mi yapsak? İngilizce gidelim, daha rahat olacak. Thank you everybody for being here. We promise a good conversation today at Kristal Elma Festivali'ni. Pleasure to be here. And welcome, Rula.
Thank you for having me.
And we had a brief introduction, I know, but let me quickly tell you a bit more about why we're here and what we want to do. So our conversation is about struggles of women in the Arab Muslim world. That's what you saw in the schedule, and that's why you wanted to be here. But we promise more because there's a lot to talk about with Rula, who is an award-winning journalist, a novelist, and a foreign policy analyst, and obviously having this conversation in Istanbul, which is in the middle of pretty much all the hot stories in the world and international media. We have so much to talk about. If you guys feel like it towards the end, if you have any questions, just raise your hand, shout out, but make sure that it's a good question. So maybe in the final...
And even a bad question, if I may. Actually, we like those more. Don't be shy. You can ask whatever you want, except personal stuff. That I will not answer.
Exactly. And last 5 minutes, maybe, if you feel like it, we can also turn to you guys for questions. Since this is the first time Rula is addressing a Turkish audience in Turkey, I want to start with your own personal story, Rula. Why does it matter? Because it tells us about why you chose this profession, why you chose to be a reporter, a journalist. Can we start with that? Tell us about yourself first.
Yes, I was raised in East Jerusalem, and obviously when you are raised in a conflict zone, this is the first thing you grew up obviously very sensitive to social justice, the issue of justice, to conflict, to minority rights, and all of these issues matter to me because we were the afflicted in a war zone. But I watched international media, and my school was in this area called Sheikh Jarrah, and it was behind the American Colony Hotel. And in that hotel, international media used to reside. So I used to go at a very young age and watch these international reporters getting drunk in the bar or telling each other stories. And then I would basically watch the news, and I would never see stories of people that I thought are worthy of telling their own stories. And the stories of people who were voiceless, women who were oppressed, minorities, basically the people who did not have a voice in the chambers of power, who were excluded. And the more I grew up, the more I realized the world needs to hear certain stories, more and more. And one of the reasons is, basically for me, was the turning point was the second Intifada in 2000, when I realized that the world was basically blaming the Palestinians for their own suffering. We were under occupation for a long time, and we were blamed. It's like, why don't you find your Nelson Mandela? It's like, well, our Nelson Mandela is in jail or killed. And then they would ask me questions like, why Palestinians are so violent? And it's like, oh, well, you know that Palestinians live under military occupation, they don't have no rights, there are segregated realities. So I did not understand where the ignorance came from. And then I realized most people get their information from television. And most of television, and we've seen this in a small way before, we are internationally the most entertained. We love Hollywood and Bollywood. We saw this before. But we have a hard time with real news and reality. With all due respect, I feel that our role in the media is to tell the audience uncomfortable truths and hard truths and things that they don't want to talk about. People want to live in a fantasy, but I think what they need is reality. After 9/11, I think most Americans thought that they are at war with Islam. They didn't understand that the Muslim world is 1.5 billion people around the world, a quarter of humanity. And I started thinking, wait 1 second, we need to explain to them because that will lead to policies, for example, the occupation of Iraq and the invasion of Iraq. So I thought, why Americans are approving of this. Because most of them, they thought, well, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda somehow had to do with the Saddam regime, which was a wrong information. So my job is not to tell what everybody's saying, is to tell what nobody's saying and push on that.
And it's difficult wherever you are in the world. If you're a TV journalist and if you want people to watch serious stories, people get bored. People are like, oh, okay, fine, yet another war, more refugees, crises, and boring stuff.
It's
and
not
then,
boring if it's relevant to the reality.
Exactly. Well,
And everything is interconnected. For example, if you think that something doesn't affect your life, you're actually wrong. 9/11, it basically affected the whole world. After 9/11, many things have changed. If you go to any airport around the world and you come from a Muslim majority country, you're basically is looked at as potential terrorist eventually, or as a suspect in any area around the world. The dynamic between the world has changed. If you thought that the Syrian war would not affect your life 6 years ago, now, not only with the refugees, but with the rise of xenophobic populist movements around the world, from Donald Trump to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to basically Marine Le Pen in France, to other places, if you think this is not the consequences of one war or conflicts around the Middle East, you're wrong. If you think that the Arab Spring, where people stood up demanding three things: social justice, freedom, and democracy, these are basic human rights. If you think that these things has nothing to do with somebody that is living in, let's say, Texas, they were wrong. Because guess what? Those certain regimes will ask the United States for aid and for help. It's interconnected, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. And I think it's important to pay attention to that.
we'll get to all the famous populists that steal the headlines these days, but before that, I want to go back to...
Let's talk also about
have
the
a favorite
orange
one?
orangutan that won the election in America.
Yeah, I know you're a great fan of him, and we'll definitely
Absolutely,
get to Trump
and
and
I'm sure he
Trump's
is of
America
mine.
as well. In your personal story, Rula, I know, because I'm familiar with your work, that women played a really important role.
Yes.
You wrote a novel, and and that partly was an effort on your side to come to terms with your own personal story and what your mother went through. Another important woman in your life was in the movie Hind Hosseini, in the movie Miral, who established the orphanage Dar al Tifl, at a time when the region was going through a very difficult, tense moment. But what she thought was, there is still a future, and without education, there will be no future. So those two women played a very important role in your life. Since our conversation is about the role, how to empower women in this region, I want to talk specifically about this a little bit. And it's so heartbreaking that this is a problem in the entire world, but in the Middle East, we need to do a lot more work. Just a couple of things that I thought was quite striking, and I wanted to share with our audience too. Can you believe that every 7 seconds a young girl becomes a bride under the age of 15? These are just recent statistics from Save the Children. This isn't just someone thought of this. And funny enough, we keep focusing on education. It turns out that girls in the Middle East do way better than boys, and this is also statistically proven, and at school, we mean. So it seems like there's a lot that can be done here in terms of empowering young women and women in general in this region. But why are we having such a hard time making progress? What is your take on that?
I hope the men in this room are ready to hear that, which we're talking about dropping some hard truth.
They look pretty early.
So basically, the 2 people or 3 people that inspired me were women. One of them, you're right, was indirectly my mother, who died when I was 5. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be a journalist, it's also because I felt her story was relevant. My mother was raped at a very young age. She struggled to tell her family. She told her family, and they didn't believe her, basically. So that trauma she carried for a long time, and she ended up killing herself, committing suicide. It's the voiceless people who are never given justice that basically haunt my whole journey. And I feel like somehow, somewhere, those voiceless people from their grave are still calling me to do something important. More than important, somehow to shed light about these stories and give them a little justice. And justice doesn't mean that it's hard sometimes to persecute perpetrators, and it's a failure of our system. But what's the hardest point is to make it hard for victims to come forward and tell their own stories because they're blamed because they were dressed like you or me, or because basically we look at them as women who are not supposed to be in the public space. And I think this is the fundamental issue, that women should not be in the public space because men have hard time controlling their instincts. And I find it interesting because this is what you hear in India, for example. I wish the actor before us had mentioned a little bit about these issues. This is a country that has a lot of struggle a lot with those issues. I wrote an op-ed, I think, in 2012, when an Indian girl in a bus was raped. And I realized that my own daughter, who's named Miral, who's the name of the movie and the book, sent me that article and said, Mom, did you read about that? And I realized where her favorite book is Toni Morrison, Beloved. So basically, that kind of trauma transcends generation. My daughter never met my mother. I don't even remember my mother. But that story somehow became part of our tragedy, whether she was there or she wasn't there, but that is in our DNA. And you transfer that story and that kind of trauma. So I decided to tell these stories of women who are raped in war zones, in Syria, in Libya, and elsewhere. And they're raped on a daily basis. And rape doesn't mean only the physical rape, but we are basically, when they attack me, because I tell some people that are racist and xenophobe on Italian television or on American television, when they come after me, they're trying to send a message to all kinds of women. You need to stay silent. And I think I'm not brave, but for me, bravery is basically being able to control your fear and not let your fear control you. This is the second lesson I learned from my mentor, Hind Husseini. She was 30. She found 55 kids in the street in 1948. She took them back home. She gave them an education. She built an orphanage, a school, a university, and she gave thousands of girls, like myself, orphans, an education. When you invest in the education of your girls, you're investing in your own future, in your own stability. It's not a coincidence that most important companies, Alibaba, for example, they have 50% of the women who work, 50% of the people who work there that are women. They're much more efficient, they're loyal, and they're effective. Matteo Renzi, former Prime Minister of Italy, and current Prime Minister of Italy, the cabinets, 50-50. Why? Not only because we're 50% of the population, which matters, that means we vote and we choose our representative, but because we can make effective policies. I am sorry, I look at the Middle East with incredible politicians. We are 300 million people. I don't remember any government that had 50-50 or 30 or 20.
Why
Lebanese
let's
government
get to that,
has
because
one woman, one woman in government, and she's the wife of somebody, and she has no portfolio.
Why is
It's
this not
a
a
scandal.
policy priority? Why is this not a policy priority? What stops it in this region?
Well, men will not give us that, so we need to fight for it, let's be honest. Power never concede anything without demand. Never will, never did. We have to fight for it. I think one of the, I'm fascinated by the history of the activists who fought slavery in America. One of them is Frederick Douglass, and he used to say one thing that always impressed me and always stayed with me for a long time, spoke to me. And it's something like, power never concede anything without a demand. A struggle must be a struggle. It can be physical, and it can be moral, and it can be both. But we must have our voice heard. I have my voice heard on television where I call out these guys, whether it's Trump lawyer or some neo-Nazi in Italy or anybody. You call them out. Whatever space you work in, you're a journalist, you're a reporter, you're a mom, or you are basically a teacher, a professor, whatever you do in life. Even if you are somebody who sells, excuse me for saying that, underwear, it doesn't matter. Whatever you do, use that power to effect change. Try to organize. Try to be much more active in the municipality election, in any election. Demand from your representative to represent you and have women. I mean, I was so impressed with Fatima Shaheen when I visited Gaziantep. Really impressed. A woman command a whole city where she has hundreds of thousands of refugees. She is the best example, I would say, of female representative of Turkey. And this country elected a woman twice. But then we get lecture about how the Muslim world treats women. Then when you have a real woman who's a Muslim like myself on television, I get hammered and harassed and get death threats because they cannot hear it. But they will, and they have to.
Since you mentioned Gaziantep, I was going to get to refugees, and that's such a difficult subject to talk about, and obviously we all know that the world is struggling with a way to cope with it. You've seen camps in Turkey, and not only in Turkey, but in other host countries, although Turkey obviously is hosting 3.5 million, roughly, Syrian refugees. You've seen camps in Lebanon, and you've been to Iraq and Jordan, and tell us what kind of an experience is that? How is the world coping with this? And comparatively, what can you say about what you've seen in Turkey and in these other countries that are hosting Syrian refugees, and how the world can possibly react to such a massive crisis?
Well, in 2011, the beginning of the Arab Spring, it was the first time I went to see basically the first camps of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And I've been following the whole story for years. So I visited, basically, I was in and out Syria. I visited the camps in Lebanon multiple times, in the Bekaa Valley, which is on the borders. I visited Jordanian camps, even the Italian camps in Sicily. And I was horrified. There's no dignity there. There's no life there. Children, women are left to the mercy of the powerful. And basically, in a stateless nation, they are stateless nation in a country that does not want them and treat them every day with huge discrimination. So I have I was a professor at the American University in Rome last year, and I had a scholarship program for Syrian girls. But I would go to recruit the girls. So I would give them tests to basically see who are the most fit to come to Europe and study. And one of the girls, I will never forget her, Niveen, and she couldn't speak because her written test was perfect, and her oral test, she would panic. And I always thought, and I interviewed her 3 times, and I said, look, darling, I have to assess who you are in order to, because you will be interviewed at the embassy and other places. I have to understand who you are. And then I thought something happened to her in Syria. But what she told me after, because I told her, look, I think you are traumatized. We'll have to find a way to make you study here. And she said, if I stay here, I die. Because the racism I witnessed in this country, and she was talking about Lebanon, is what broke me. It's not the civil war. Those words are alive in my brain. Then I went to visit Gaziantep. And honestly, I came to this wonderful country, obviously, and it was the first time in July, and I was truly impressed. I always heard, obviously, my father was a Sufi, and he designed the gardens of the Aqsa Mosque, and his dream was always to pray in 2 places that he loved the most. One is the Blue Mosque, and the other one is the Aqsa Mosque. So I promised him if one day I'll make it to Turkey, I will come and to the Blue Mosque. But when I went to Gaziantep, I thought I should pray in that place, because if there's any place that basically my father would feel that humanity is standing up for other human beings, that we are basically the shining city in the hill, that is Gaziantep. What they did, I saw broken men and women everywhere in the Middle East, Syrians and other refugees, but I saw people with dignity. I saw people treated with respect. I saw an incredible foreign policy of Turkey that is basically your refugee policy is your foreign policy. And the world was ignoring that fact. I saw Fatima Shaheen walking around like a rock star. Even more successful than the guy that left before us, by the way. Because she changed people's lives. They came to her, they hugged her, they kissed her, she saved them, and she gave them hope and future. Mm-hmm. What I saw, also people who were genuinely committed to the Turkish state, who felt, and they told me, the Syrian I interviewed, they said, look, we feel like we are part of the same ummah, the same nation, that we're treated as equal. And they were not only grateful, they wanted to contribute and do more. We went inside Syria, we went to Jarablus, and I heard about Al-Bab, and what you did there was impressive. Obviously, But it comes with a heavy cost for the nation, economically and in terms of security. But this is one of the best aspects of Turkey. Your hospitality and generosity toward the Syrian refugee will be remembered for decades and for generations. And I think the rest of the world should be ashamed of how they treated the Syrian refugees. Some of them, they exploited them. So the populist movements that we talked about, the racist xenophobic movement, start creating a world after 9/11, them and us, black versus white. If you're white, you're privileged and you have certain rights. Everybody else is below. And everybody else doesn't have to be Syrian. It can be you and me. So when we fight against these guys, it's because it's about our lives and our future and our children's future.
I want to ask you about, well, like we had a brief conversation about this before being here on the stage and meeting with the rest of you. It's one thing to manage the crisis, the humanitarian aspect of the crisis, but since you grew up in an interesting time in this part of the world during the first Intifada, and you experienced that, and you know what it is like, these intractable, long-running conflicts, and what they can do to the social fabric of the countries that we're talking about, the societies that we're talking about. I'm curious what you think about whether there's an end in sight for the war in Syria, how that could end. Sure, there's the humanitarian aspect of it, but also you're a foreign policy analyst, so we'd like to hear from you where you think this is headed. It's been years, and Syria is a broken country. How can it ever come back? Do you think it will ever come back?
I don't know that there is a resolution for any conflict without justice. Yes, he's winning. Assad is winning, and but what's taking place in front of our eyes is a genocide, real genocide. And this last phase will be the most brutal phase that we will see. Russians and Assad, Assad forces decided that whoever stands to them needs to be wiped out. Except we've seen that model before. It didn't work out. I'll tell you where we've seen that model. 80 years ago, Egypt, remember? Basically, the first movement of people who start demanding their rights were crushed by the regime then. And the regime was a secular regime, Nasser. They decided to crush them. They jailed them, tortured them, imprisoned them, raped them in jail. One of these guys left jail and wrote a book. That was Sayyid Qutb, Milestones. Milestone became basically the manifesto of every jihadist movement around the world. So if you don't address social injustice issues, they will come sideways and they will become radicalized. They will go underground, they will organize, they will start attacking you. Do you really think millions of Syrians around the world who see this gentleman, and I will stop here because I'm in front of this incredible audience, this war criminal doing what he did, gassing his own people, killing them, doing all kind of things, then basically opening the door for ISIS and other radicals? Do you think these millions of people who are around the world will stay silent? It's like, okay, we give up because we won. This is not a victory. This is actually, you prolong the conflict for a generation to come. I don't believe that conflict is going to be ending on those terms. Remember Hama, 82, when his father did more or less the same thing? Massacred an entire village, left the bodies on the street, and people thought, oh my God, we will be silent for a while, we are scared. Those walls of fears in 2011 were destroyed when millions of people in our region stood up and demanded democracy and dignity. Nobody, even a farmer or a person that never had access to education, instinctively they know they were born free and equal and should be treated as so. And there's no way to go around it.
We are in the final 6 minutes, last 6 minutes of our conversation, and we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask your questions as well in the audience. So my final question for the time being is, when it comes to burden sharing and handling the refugee crisis, Turkey is doing a lot and is trying to do a lot. And one of the things that Ankara complains about is that Europe isn't responding, or the West isn't responding in a cooperative way. However, I want to ask you, is this because Turkey is unable to express itself, or is it because the West is deliberately not hearing this? Not only about the humanitarian aspect of handling the war in Syria, but also, since you also teach communications, I think your comments about this would be interesting. Turkey had a horrendous experience. It was just last year, the 15th of July coup attempt, and we all remember those
Horrifying moments.
engines roaring above our heads in the city, of basically fighter jets. This is yet another area where Turkey feels like it's unable to communicate its own narrative or explain itself to the West, because the Western allies aren't able to connect with Turkey in a way that it creates this empathy and channels of communication. So I wonder whether Turkey is expressing itself in the right way, or is there something wrong elsewhere in the world that somehow it's difficult to hear what Turkey is saying?
Thank
so
you
what is
for
your take on that?
This question. Look, you remember the uncomfortable truth we were talking about? It's easier to say those truths when it comes to others. But I think, as a person who loves this country, that wants it to succeed and thrive, you're playing your country, and I'm talking now to you, Turkey, and the amazing Turkish people. Your country is doing amazing things when it comes to the Syrian refugees. You're leading internationally, and especially in a region where everything is falling apart. We have a war in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. Lebanon is unstable. Palestine is under occupation, where we have three major, basically important markets in the Middle East. You are number one. Iran is number two. Egypt number three, but it's irrelevant. And you know why it's irrelevant? Egypt is irrelevant because we have a tyrant there called Sisi who is jailing his own people, killing them, and he's not elected democratically. You have a great process, and you have a real democracy. However, I think it was horrifying what happened last year in the coup. We all, journalists of conscience, stood with Turkey in that moment. Diplomats, people around the world, start tweeting, attacking those who actually basically supporting the coup. And I was concerned. I was personally concerned because I thought, I don't want another Egypt. I don't want another tyrant who kill his own people in the streets, like Sisi did in the massacres of Rabaa and El Place. But now we are a year after. Luckily, the system held. The institutions are still there. But the uncomfortable truth, the world don't understand you because they are confused about multiple aspects. And I'm saying this as a friend of this nation that wants it to succeed. If you want the world to understand you, you don't have to give Michael Flynn $500,000 to write an article in the New York Times. He was a lobbyist for the Turkish government. And guess what? He said Turkey was great. The next day he said Islam is a sick ideology. When you have friends like this, you don't need enemies. Let's put it clear. Something else. Turkey is a country that, and from my perspective, needs much more than a PR. It needs actual policies that reflect actual values. When you are called the #1 jailer of journalists, that is the worst thing that can ever happen to a country that is doing great things on the other hand. Because people will look at you and they will not see the goodness when there's a shadow of these things. When you jail Amnesty International director in Turkey, or people who download an app, I understand that some people are criminal, like in all society, and basically they deserve to be in jail, and there's a justice system and a pathway, and understand that the judiciary have to judge them, but it cannot be that anybody that download an app or somebody that is critical or say uncomfortable things should be put in jail, because this will be basically the best PR for your opponents and enemies. This is actually a recruiting tool for all these Gulenists, because they will go around the world. It's like, oh my God, see what they are doing? You're actually serving them on a plate, a propaganda tool and an art tool. We have to be strategic about Turkey and why Turkey is so important for NATO and why its leadership is important for this region. And it is important. And you have allies and you have people who support you. But today these people are concerned because of these elements that needs to be said. And if I may add one last thing.
One more thing, because I want to make sure we have enough time to turn to the audience. We're already running out of time, but let's ask for a couple of minutes because we started late anyway. So go ahead, final sentence.
I forgot it. It's okay.
No, you were saying that basically we need to see both sides of this, and by doing these things, don't serve the enemy, because
we need the leadership
pretty
here
much
basically to. I understand the fear after last year. We all understand it, but we need, because And I obviously was around leaders who were criticized and had hard time. But look at Nelson Mandela and President Obama. These people, President Obama was called all kind of names. He was attacked. He was even questioned on his religion, ethnicity. However, he embraced his critics. Obviously not criminals, but he embraced his critics. Nelson Mandela had these people who jailed him, tortured him, and he got some of them to work for the government. We need national reconciliation for this country because will be the best PR for Turkey today and in the future.
Rula, thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Just one question from the audience would like to take. Anyone? Good questions? Bad questions?
Please.
Yes, please. That's perfectly fine. Türkçe sorabilirsiniz, ben çeviririm. I'll translate for you. Şöyle yapalım. Bize kendinizi tanıtıp sorunuzu Türkçe sorarsanız ben de sonrasında çeviririm. Şimdi mikrofonunuz var, salonda duyabilir.
Ben Dilek, ismim Dilek. Öncelikle ben teşekkür ederim. Thank you for speaking. Konuşmayı dinliyorken ben Türkiye'nin muazzam bir yerde olduğunu, Orta Doğu'da işte 1. sıradayız, 2. İran geliyor, mükemmeliz, liderlik olarak çok iyiyiz. Hani her şey mükemmel gibi bir konuşma oldu burada aslında. Gerçekten mültecilere sahip çıkmayı hani hepimiz çok içten eminim istiyoruz. Bu çok güzel, hani ülke olarak takdir gördüğümüz bir yan. Ama bunun bize getirdiği olumsuzluklar var aslında. Şu an onlara değinilmedi mesela. Ekonomik anlamda zor bir dönemden geçiyoruz. Vergiler, enflasyon vesaire. Hani Türkiye gerçek anlamda aslında Orta Doğu'yla kıyaslamak değil, dünyanın da kıyaslamasını da burada isterdim. Hem Müslüman
Türkiye ile dünyayı kıyaslamasını isterdiniz.
Aynen. Bir yandan da aslında sadece güzel yanlarını gösterip Türkiye çok çok güzel bir durumda gibi gösterdi. Şu anki aslında biraz daha sıkıntılardan haberdar mı? Ona yansıyan boyutları var mı aslında? Onu merak ediyorum.
Bir, Türkiye'yi dünyayla kıyaslamak, onu orada nerede duruyor? İkincisi hep güzel taraflarından bahsedildi. Türkiye kendi içinde zorluklar da yaşıyor. Bunlardan haberdar mı? Değil mi?
Aslında hep olumlu yanları ve gerçekten dışarıya sempatik gözükme durumumuz var söz konusu. Güzel bir şey ama bir yandan olumsuz tarafları ve bize yansıyan taraflarında analiz edilmiş mi ve haberdar mı gerçekten merak ediyorum.
So very quickly, Dilek, your name, isminiz Dilek Hanım. Dilek Hanım's question is that it looks like Turkey is being compared with the rest of the Middle Eastern countries in terms of how we're reacting to the refugee crisis, but in terms of vis-a-vis the rest of the world, where does Turkey stand? And what she is highlighting is that we're looking at all the positive sides and how Turkey is doing such a great job handling this crisis, but on the other hand, there are lots of domestic difficulties that this problem also brought upon Turkey. Are you aware of that? Have you been focusing on them? Have you been analyzing them? That was the question.
Yes, because I followed also the radicalization and all the terrorist attacks. Actually, my piece in the New York Times last week mentioned some of that, but because of space, all the terrorist attacks were carried by ISIS in the areas, and also of the social tension. Look, when you have 3 million people all together in one country in a short span of time, that absolutely bring a lot of social tension. Nobody's ignoring that, and the world has left you alone in this. I think the world needs to do much more, and it's shameful that Europe is doing as little as they can, because remember, after World War II, the world welcomed their refugees, and it can happen to anybody, by the way. So it's today the Syrians, tomorrow somebody else, and they need to be aware of that. Turkey lost soldiers in NATO fighting other wars, but when it came to how to protect Turkey, basically the world's like, okay, yeah, because Turkey, and not only Turkey, this whole region, and especially the way they view us in Europe decided that they are a Christian white club, and Turkey is not there because we are Muslims. That's bottom line what boils down to it, and it's a tragedy. But if we give them the element to judge us as inferior, and this is when it comes to communication. I don't know, I mean, I was around some of the leaders, and the best leaders in the world are the ones that have people who tell them what they want to hear, but above all, they have people who tell them the uncomfortable truth and how to convey a better vision. We need you guys, and I'm saying this not as a European who I am. We need you because this region is falling apart. Your leadership is important. what you are doing as a nation is incredibly important to a lot of us. It inspired us, and it's inspiring millions of people around the world. However, tell your leaders that the image outside is as important as the image inside. Your leader is loved here. That we know. But we need the world to understand what he's doing. And I think if they're confused about the signals, it can be a problem. Thank you so
The
much for
music
being
memes,
here.
it's the end of it. Rula, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler vaktiniz için. Hoşça kalın.